And when we're talking about the public service, let's go down to my old state of South Australia, where far from having troubles with being able to get public servants, they've got too many of them. Now, I suspect these people don't work in the health system. In fact, the people we're talking about here, most of them worked, or I should say used to work, in the Department of Transport and Infrastructure. They have in South Australia 118 of what they call excess public servants who sit supposedly in what is referred to as a waiting room. Now, these are public servants, and these numbers have basically doubled in the last 4 years, from 51 in 2020 now to 118 in 2024. So these are people who've been put off work, I don't know, their jobs have been made redundant or their roles have changed, etc. But for whatever reason, they can't actually be sacked from the public service. So they are told, you just go and wait for us to find a job for you to do. Meanwhile, you're on full pay. I mean, how good does this sound? Where do I get one of these jobs? 118 of them. 94 of them have not worked for at least 9 months. I mean, they've been at home on gardening leave. I don't know, they've been on caravan holidays, doing whatever they want all week, 9 months at least, on full pay. Now, the average public servant in South Australia gets 95.5 grand every year. Now, of course, average includes teachers and nurses, so that drags the average down. So if we're to assume that you've made it to a level where you basically can't be sacked, you're probably well into the $100,000 mark, and there's 118 of them in South Australia alone. I'd hate to think about the rest of the country, sitting around doing that, just waiting for a job. And can you believe it? The government said, this is to quote the Advertiser, government officials say excess employees who, for a variety of reasons, are surplus to requirements but still have a job, undertake different tasks. This has previously included helping with the COVID-19 response and minor maintenance work. So they're just sitting there waiting
Well, you've
for someone.
changed that light bulb,
Hey, Barry, we need someone to put a lick of paint on the front of the hospital today. You reckon you can do it? Seriously.
I love their definition. An excess employee is a staff member who is surplus to requirements but still has a job.
Still has a job.
Well, how do you have a job if you're surplus to requirements? This would never be tolerated in the private sector.
No
this would be
way.
Gross mismanagement.
And these
but in
guys
the public
don't
service,
care.
It's not a problem.
Oh, it's taxpayer money.
Yeah.
Taxpayer money.
And that's the problem. They've never had their own business, so they've never run a business,
No.
and they've never had to spend their own money or put their own capital on the line.
No.
And so you end up with wastage like this.
And yet, you should be using the taxpayer dollar even more sacredly than you would if you were running your own business, because at least then you're only throwing around your own money and taking risks. This is everybody else's hard-earned cash. And notice the disdain with which they try to explain this away, like South Australians are just stupid flogs who are going to be like, oh, yeah, so they're excess to requirements, but they've still got a job. They didn't explain it at all. You've got 118 bums, not in seats, doing absolutely nothing on full pay. But everyone in every single state knows that the number of excess employees when it comes to government are a lot higher than that. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. What am I saying? I love it when it's about government. But this is, we learned last year that 1 in 5 workers in Australia works for the government. Now, if you're essential services, if you're a nurse, if you're a policeman, if you're an AMBO, if you're one of those guys, thank you. You run the country. You are the backbone. We literally wouldn't be alive without you. I'm talking about all the people who are sitting in these bloated government departments that we know are doing sweet jack all with their 9 to 5. It used to be that when someone was in the public service, we knew that they were actually paid slightly less than the average person in the private sector, but they also did slightly less as well. Since when have we not heard someone say, oh, I work in the public sector, and we all roll our eyes, right? But nowadays, everyone knows these guys have never been paid more to do so little.
And next time you hear the government boast about how they've got unemployment down, Yeah, they've got unemployment down by having a waiting room.
Exactly.
Where they pay people to
right.
sit around. But I tell you what, the economic figures look fantastic.
It's the doll.
Bear in mind, they're on 15% super public servants as well. And
my
the rest of us
goodness,
or actually it's probably more, because it used to be, when it was 10% in the private sector, it was 15, and what's it now, 12 odd percent in the private sector. So it's probably 17% in the public sector now. But I used to sit, we're talking about Adelaide, I used to go to a cafe regularly in the city in Adelaide, and without fail, every day at roughly 3 p.m, there was a public service building next door. This same group would always come in and they'd sit there for about 45 minutes and have a coffee and a chat. And I thought, hang on a minute, so you've probably had a 1 hour lunch break earlier in the day, you probably had morning tea and smoko, and now you're coming in at 3 o'clock and you're sitting here for 45 minutes, gas bag and having coffee, and then you probably go back to the office and do 15 minutes of emails and get on the bus and go home.
I just want to know, what do you say at parties when people say, so what do you do for work? Oh, I'm an excess employee. Would you say that with a straight face?
I am so important that even when they have no work for me to do, they're keeping me
They just want me to hang around.
They cannot part with me.